Hi Year 13, this is the first of your 3 lessons for Friday, remembering that on a usual Friday we would have had 2 face-to-face lessons and 1 independent study time. And so what I would like you to do is firstly complete the planning session in this lesson, in which we will think about the exam response that I would like you to prepare. And then in the next lesson, I will talk you through how to structure your response. And then finally, independently, I would like you to write an exam response, remembering that it's really important for you to submit these because I'm going to need lots and lots of evidence should we not end up sitting the exams in the summer to be able to justify your grade. And the work you did last lesson was really strong, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Okay, so from the essays that I have read, I was overall delighted with the responses that I received. Lots of you scored a higher mark than you've achieved in the past, which was wonderful to see. Your introductions were really impressive to your exam responses and demonstrated progress in your academic writing. All of you used the clear GST introduction structure, and that made your writing highly comparative from the beginning. It grounded your responses to the text in your knowledge of context and also meant that every single one of you had a really clear thesis. So all of you scored really good marks in your AO1 department. I'll break down that on the next slide as well. All of you examined how context shaped the text that you examined. All the way through your essay, you constantly referred back to that, which was wonderful to see. And most of you also demonstrated wider reading and alternative readings of the text by including critical quotes or a feminist or even a structuralist interpretation of the text. So well done for that. They were really, really high quality pieces of work. So as a class then, overall, I felt that all of us followed quite a similar pattern in terms of the work that you produced. AO1, the response to text, that was really strong for all of you. All of you had a clear thesis and you developed that line of analysis throughout. So AO1, I feel, is something we're really strong on. AO2, which is how you examine a writer's use of methods. You all use lots of quotations, which is really good, but as a class, this is our area of focus, and I'm going to talk you through in the next lesson how we can make sure we focus on that, how we can examine the methods in more detail, what we can do with a quotation to make sure that we score highly for AO2. AO3, which is your understanding of context and how it shapes the text, that was awesome for all of the essays. AO4, comparison, again, awesome. You all were highly comparative throughout. You didn't write about the texts as 2 separate entities. You weaved together your knowledge in order to answer your thesis. AO5, wider reading and different interpretations. I saw evidence of AO5 in all of the essays, but the essays that were most successful included critical quotations, either ones that we have learned in class or ones that you found yourself, and that really helped to boost the score. So I would encourage you in the next essay to focus on your AO2 methods and what you can do with a quotation to examine a writer's use of methods and show awareness of the writer's craft. And AO5, I'd like you all to be thinking about how you can find critical quotes, just short ones that are easily remembered, to include in your response. Okay, so the question that we're going to be building towards answering today is examine ideas about motherhood in the texts that you have studied. You should write about Top Girls and at least 2 poems from feminine gospels. Now, I've simplified the question. It won't look like this in the exam. In the exam, you would have a quotation and then you'd be asked to respond to it in terms of the text that you have studied. Your quotation will be something like, in modern literature, motherhood is presented as blah, blah, blah. Examine this view in the text that you have studied. So I've simplified it to make it super clear for us what we need to do. In terms of our planning session, by the end of this lesson, we're going to seek to answer the following 2 big questions. Question 1, what are the big ideas about motherhood in Top Girls? And then 2, what are the big ideas about motherhood in feminine gospels? You don't need to answer them now. We're going to do some planning and preparation that will mean that we're able to easily answer these questions, hopefully by the end of this session. So I would like you to begin your planning by thinking about Top Girls. Remember, we always think about the longer text first, and then because we've got a range of poems to choose from, it's easier then to choose our poems after and compare them. So there are two ways of doing this, and I don't mind how you present your work. I've chosen to do this in a table because I think it will be really clear for me to look back through my notes and then help me to write a response. You could do it in a mind map if you want. It's entirely up to you. I prefer a table because I think it's really clear. So we're going to answer 4 questions in our planning. So you might like to pause the video now and give yourself plenty of room to write in each box and draw a table to help you to respond to our planning task. Okay, so now you have your table or your mind map set up. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to think about which characters in Top Girls are mothers, and you're just going to write down their name in this section here. Which characters in Top Girls are mothers? Pause the video and just jot down at least 5 presentations of motherhood in terms of character in that box. Off you go. Okay, so in our second box, the experience box, this one here, you're now going to be thinking about your character. So, I'm really rubbish at writing on here. Marlene. I'm just going to call her Ma, it'll be easier. Marlene, and then you'd be thinking about her experience of motherhood. Was she a mother? Who was she mother to? What was the relationship between them like? Okay, fill out that box now for each of the characters that you've identified as mothers. Thirdly, you'll be thinking about the big idea. So we're thinking about what Churchill wanted to convey about motherhood through that character. So through Marlene's experience of being a mother to Angie, what did Churchill want to communicate to her reader about motherhood? And then finally, you're going to look through the text and you're going to find some quotations to examine. So this task is going to take you a fair amount of time, probably around 15 minutes. I'd like you to fill out the table, examining the character, the experience, the big idea, and the quotations you could use. Off you go. Okay, and before I put the table up, I'd like to remind you to have a go at this task independently, but I have got some answers to help us to consolidate our learning and to plug any gaps in our knowledge that we might have had if we've missed lessons, etc. So I'm going to really quickly talk you through my very bare bones notes that will help to structure my essay. So I've identified Marlene as a mother. Her experience was that she was biological mother to Angie, but she didn't spend a lot of time with her. Instead, Marlene left Angie with Joyce to focus on her career. But that ultimately leads to a lot of sadness in Marlene's character and positions us to see Marlene as a character worthy of sympathy. Now, the big idea that I think Churchill wanted to communicate through that was that women do, in this modern world that is presented by Churchill of the 80s, women had to make a choice between motherhood and a career, which led to quite a lot of sadness because ultimately, whilst Marlene severs her physical ties to Angie, it does lead to sadness. And I think a part of the text for the quotation section that you could have included there was when Marlene cries when she returns home. I think that shows that although she's masked everything and focused on her career and become this really hardened career woman who was modelled on Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, ultimately she's masking a lot of emotional sadness that she feels at the loss of connection between her and her daughter. Secondly, then, I had to think about Joyce. Joyce is a mother to Angie, but there's a strained relationship and definitely resentment on both sides, as demonstrated at the beginning of Act 2, where Joyce and Angie both swear about each other. Do you remember we looked at the engendered language? I don't feel comfortable about saying the quotation on YouTube, but the effing rotten little C-bomb one would be an interesting quotation to examine there in terms of the resentment. And the resentment comes between them because Joyce feels that being a mother to Angie led to her entrapment in her working class world. So the 80s was a time of great stratification between working and middle classes, but there was an element of social movement. So Marlene came from a working class background, but the job that she had positioned her to escape that working class background. Joyce, however, felt very entrapped, that being a mother led to her having to focus on motherhood rather than a career. So again, the big idea here is that women seem to have to choose between motherhood and a career, which can ultimately lead to resentment. So through those two characters, Churchill shows us that whilst women have more opportunities in society, is not necessarily liberating for all women, because women still have to make a choice between motherhood and a career. So Churchill presents the 80s as a time of opportunity for women, but also as a time of difficulty for women as well, because they have to choose. I think Churchill shows us that women did have to make a choice and couldn't successfully balance both. And I think she's trying to almost perform a critique of feminism in the 80s. Okay, Dulgret, her son was killed, if we remember in Act 1 from her talking, and she goes to hell to go and get him back. And for me, the big idea there shows the strength of a mother's love. Through the characters from the past that Churchill uses, she's trying to demonstrate how far things have moved on, but also some universal ideas, some ideas that exist within the past and still the present. So Dulgret for me has been used to demonstrate that the strength of a mother's love hasn't changed over time. And that idea is further communicated through Marlene and through her sadness that she feels at her sacrifice of her relationship with her child. The strength of a mother's love is still very much there. Patient Griselda, perhaps one of the saddest stories in the whole of the play. She has children, but they're taken away from her and eventually returned. But she's forced to place her obedience to her husband over her relationship with her child. And what Churchill demonstrates through that is that women at that period of time didn't have any choice in their path in life. A woman's place in society was to be obedient and follow the instructions of her husband. So Griselda, unlike Marlene and Joyce, had no choice in the matter. She had to sacrifice her relationship with her children. Now, she obviously experienced sadness through that sacrifice, but ultimately it wasn't a choice that she had made, so she felt more at peace with it, whereas Marlene and Joyce have to make choices. And so through exploring that relationship between the past and the present, Churchill shows to us that women in the past didn't have a choice, but now the choice that's presented to women leads to further suffering. They must sacrifice something in some way. Pope Joan, when she has a child, she doesn't understand her female body because she lived her life as a man, but when she has a child, that led to the end of her career. Again, showing this idea that women have to make a choice between motherhood and a career. And so that for me demonstrates the big idea in Top Girls, this idea of choice. Women in the past didn't have a choice, but because of feminism, women now have a choice, but that choice isn't necessarily liberating. It can in some ways be limiting and restrictive. So having thought about the mothers in Top Girls and the big ideas that each mother represents, I would like you now to have a go at answering the question highlighted. That's one of our big questions for today. What are the big ideas about motherhood in Top Girls? You might like to use a not only but also or a despite one of the sentence perimeters that we've practiced using in class. Off you go. Okay, I'm not going to talk through your response to that because I want you to think independently about the big ideas about motherhood. Secondly then, let's move on to our poems. Again, you might like to spend some time preparing a table in which to present your ideas, or a mind map, whatever worked for you in the Top Girls planning section. And on this table, I would like you to name a poem here that explores about ideas about motherhood. Then I would like you to tell me what's the experience of the narrator, or Duffy herself if it's one of her autobiographical poems, of motherhood. What is the big idea that Duffy communicates, and which quotations will you explore? Again, you should spend 15 minutes doing that. Off you go. I remind you again that if you haven't paused the video and worked independently on your tables, I would like you to do that before you have a look at my answers. It's really important to be thinking about the text independently, because that's what you'll do in the exam. So then, I have named 4 poems that I think explore motherhood. There are more as well. The Long Queen could have gone on there, but I chose to leave that one out. The Cord, The Light Gatherer, Sub, and Work. In the Cord then, which we've only recently explored, so hopefully it's still fresh in your mind, this is Duffy's poem to Ella. She explores the connection between the two and how it moves from physical, when they're physically attached by the cord, and when they're physically attached by their experience of breastfeeding, to a more emotional connection as Ella grows and becomes physically independent of Duffy. As that happens, she still remains emotionally dependent on her, and her mother's always there to guide her. So the big idea that Duffy communicates is that the bond, the emotional bond, as well as the physical bond between mother and daughter, is unbreakable. No matter what happens, they'll always have their love for each other. And again, I think we could connect that to Top Girls, because Marlene, although she doesn't see Angie very much, and although Angie's grown up not realising that Marlene is her mother, there's still that sense of emotional attachment that we see through Marlene's sadness. And this is where I'd like you to think carefully in your quotation section about how you can examine methods, because the work that we've done in the last 2 lessons will contribute to your ability to analyse a writer's methods. And if you remember, we looked at universal metaphors, we looked at stars and what they convey, ornithological imagery through the rook, all of the fairy tale imagery as well, and how that showed Ella's childhood. So you might like to add to your quotation sections with quotations that are going to be high scoring in terms of your ability to analyse them because of their use of universal metaphors. Okay, The Light Gatherer then. Again, this is a poem for Ella, and Duffy's complete awe of her love for Ella and how it just keeps growing and growing. Ella remains something really important and precious in Duffy's life, and the focus of all of Duffy's attention. So again, this communicates the unbreakable bond, which we could again compare and contrast to Top Girls. And in terms of how we can make sure we focus on methods, we could look at the light imagery, the references to precious materials that we picked up on in our last lesson. So I think for your exam response, I would definitely like you to choose at least one of those, either the Cord or the Light Gatherer. But I think in terms of comparison with Top Girls, one of the following 2 poems, Sub or Work, might help to build upon your thesis. So in Sub, the narrator achieves great success during and prior to pregnancy. When she is pregnant, she manages to do something amazing in baseball. I don't know the sporting terms, but she has to take a break from her career after becoming a mother. After a while, though, she's free to go back to achieving success. And I think Duffy, when we compare it with Churchill, shows how much society has moved on in just those 20 years between the texts being written. So Duffy seems to convey the idea that motherhood still does create an obstacle in a woman's career, and therefore a woman's career perhaps wouldn't be as clear and easier path as for a man if they choose to become a mother. But ultimately, that in Duffy society, women have a choice to do anything they like, and that they can balance motherhood and a career, even if motherhood does create an obstacle. I do think Duffy's reference to the fact that motherhood kept her busy at home demonstrates the idea that we perhaps don't live in a perfect society, that women do have to sometimes take a pause in their career. Quotations that you could use the one I just mentioned, motherhood kept me busy at home. Or you could use slim on a whim to show how quickly she's able to adapt and change and still achieve success. Work then in this poem, the story of the poem, just to recap because we haven't looked at that one for a little while, is that as a woman becomes a mother to more and more children, the pressure builds on her. So it starts off with talking about how when she had one mouth to feed, she worked in a domestic sphere. But as time went on, because it's also a poem about changing times as well, how women's role in society has moved from a domestic sphere to one of an ever-changing world of increased industry and business. And that shows the growing pressure on women. So I think the big idea here is that women who balance a career and motherhood have to work twice as hard in the modern world, because it's almost like they have two jobs. They're balancing their responsibilities as a mother with their responsibilities as a career woman. So I think Duffy's demonstrating that women almost work twice as hard in the modern world. So in terms of quotations and methods, again, you could look at like the changing spheres of women's roles and how that's changed over time, and how in a modern world there's increased pressure on women. Which leads us to hopefully being able to answer our second big question. And again here, because I think Duffy shows a real variation in her ideas about motherhood, about how motherhood is something quite precious and amazing and unbreakable, but also something that causes a lot of pressure and perhaps a changing career, etc. So I'd like you to have a go now at answering our second big question. And then by the end of this lesson, you will have thought about the big ideas in both texts. You might have started to think about connections between the two texts, and you'll have two clear tables that will enable you to plan successfully your exam response in the next session. Okay.